The evening air was cold and the streets were full of noise. Cars rushed by. People laughed near coffee shops and the smell of baked bread drifted through the air. Among all that movement, a thin man walked slowly, his eyes scanning the faces that passed him. His clothes were wrinkled and faded, his shoes almost torn. He carried a small backpack, the strap held together by a safety pin. His stomach growled quietly. He hadn't eaten since the day before, just some leftovers someone had handed him behind a bakery. He had walked miles that day searching, not for shelter, not even for sympathy, but for a piano. A real piano. Music had once been his world. Years ago, he had played in beautiful concert halls. His fingers had danced across shining keys while people in fine clothes watched in silence. But life changed. One wrong turn, one loss too many, and everything disappeared. He had no home, no stage, no audience, only memories and a deep hunger, both for food and for the music he once lived for. As he walked past a bright restaurant with big glass windows, he heard the faint sound of a piano inside. It wasn't live music, just a recorded tune playing over the speakers. But it made his heart ache. Through the window, he saw a grand piano sitting near the corner of the dining area. Its surface shone under soft yellow lights, untouched. He stopped, his breath fogging up the glass. Inside, people were eating, laughing, and talking. Waiters moved quickly from table to table. He stood there for a moment, watching, feeling like he didn't belong anywhere near that world anymore. But his eyes didn't leave the piano. His stomach growled again, louder this time. He pressed a hand to it and took a deep breath. Then, after a long pause, he walked to the door. The warm air hit his face as he stepped inside. Heads turned immediately. A few diners looked at him with discomfort, others with quiet curiosity. The smell of grilled food made his mouth water, but he tried not to look hungry. He walked straight to the counter where a young waiter was wiping glasses. The waiter frowned slightly, glancing up and down at him. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked in a careful tone. The man swallowed hard. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said softly, his voice almost breaking. "I was wondering, could I maybe play the piano here? Just for a little while?" The waiter blinked, not sure if he heard right. "Play the piano?" he repeated. "We don't really do that sort of thing. Are you looking for a job or something?" He shook his head. No job. I just want to play. Maybe if I could perform a song or two, I could get something to eat?" His eyes darted toward the kitchen door as he said that last part. The waiter's expression changed to discomfort. I don't think that's how things work here," he said with a nervous laugh. "You'd have to ask the manager." The man nodded, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. "Could you please ask them for me?" he said quietly. The waiter sighed and disappeared through a side door. Around him he could feel eyes watching. A couple sitting nearby whispered to each other. Someone snickered. He heard the faint words, "He wants to play for food," followed by laughter. A few moments later, the manager appeared, a tall man in a dark vest with a clean smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sir," the manager said, "my staff tells me you'd like to play our piano." "Yes," he said quickly. "Just one or two songs. I don't want to cause trouble. I can play. I promise I won't be in the way." The manager gave a polite smile. "We usually have professionals for that," he said, glancing at the man's worn-out shoes. "But sure, if you'd like to play one song, go ahead. Just don't disturb our guests, all right?" The man's face brightened with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," he whispered. As he walked toward the piano, some diners chuckled quietly. "This should be interesting," one man muttered to his date. "Maybe he'll play chopsticks," another joked. He ignored them. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his backpack gently on the floor beside the piano bench. He sat down slowly, his back straightening for the first time that day. The soft light above reflected on the polished keys. He ran his fingertips across them almost as if greeting an old friend. For a moment he just sat there, his heart pounding. He could feel the room's doubt pressing on him, the whispers, the smirks, the sideways glances. But when his fingers settled on the keys, all that disappeared. The noise of the room faded. In his mind, there was only the piano and the memory of who he once was. He pressed a single key. The sound was pure and strong. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. But before any real music came, the manager called out lightly, "Remember, just one song, all right?" His voice carried a mocking tone. The man nodded silently and continued, He started slow, testing the feel of the keys, letting the sound fill the air gently. The first few notes drifted across the restaurant, soft and uncertain like a whisper in a crowded room. A waiter walking by stopped. A fork froze halfway to someone's mouth. The melody grew richer, deeper. His hands began to move faster, more confidently. The air changed. Not everyone noticed right away, but something about the sound made people pause. And yet, before the moment could fully bloom, the man stopped. His stomach twisted painfully, pulling him back to the reality he couldn't escape. He pressed his palms together and whispered to himself, "Please, just a little longer." Then he sat still again. The manager, thinking he was done, clapped his hands once. "All right, thank you, sir." But then the man began again. This time the first few notes were stronger, clear enough to silence the nearby laughter. The sound carried emotion, real emotion, the kind that only comes from someone who's lost something and is still searching for it. His hands glided over the keys as if they were part of him. The restaurant grew quieter, though not everyone realized why yet. Some still whispered. A few still smirked. But the music was starting to change the air. Then suddenly the man stopped again. He lifted his hands and looked around. His stomach growled loudly, breaking the brief silence. Embarrassed, he stood up quickly and whispered to the manager, "I'm sorry. I'll stop. Thank you for letting me play." The manager, half smiling, half annoyed, waved him off. "That's fine, sir. Maybe come back when you've eaten something." The man nodded, picked up his backpack, and left quietly. As he walked out, he heard someone laugh again, but he didn't turn around. Outside, the night air hit his face like a cold slap. He stood still for a moment, looking through the restaurant window again. The piano sat there, shining, silent, waiting. Inside, life went on as if nothing had happened. He took a deep breath and began walking again, his shoes scraping against the pavement. His body was tired, but his heart still carried the faint echo of those keys. He whispered to himself, "One day, they'll listen." And with that quiet promise, he disappeared into the dark street, where neon lights flickered and the sound of the city drowned everything else. The sound of the door closing behind him seemed louder than it should have been. The man stood on the sidewalk, hands deep in his pockets, the city lights reflecting on the wet pavement. For a few seconds, he just stared at the restaurant window, watching the people inside go back to their laughter and meals. The warmth in there felt like another world compared to the chill outside. He turned away slowly and started walking down the street. His stomach hurt from emptiness, but his heart hurt even more. It wasn't the laughter that cut the deepest, it was the look in their eyes. That look that said he didn't belong anywhere near them. He found an empty bench near a bus stop and sat down. The night wind brushed against his face. He rubbed his hands together for warmth and looked down at his fingers. They were thin and dry, with small cracks near the nails, but those hands still remembered music. Every note, every scale, every song he had once poured his soul into was still there. He whispered to himself, "If only they knew." His voice was soft, almost lost in the wind. A young boy selling newspapers stopped near him. "Sir, you okay?" the boy asked carefully. The man smiled weakly and nodded. "I'm fine," he lied. The boy looked at him for a moment longer, then handed him a half-eaten sandwich from his bag. "Here, you can have this," he said. The man hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet thank you. The boy smiled and hurried off before he could say anything more. He unwrapped the sandwich slowly and took small bites, closing his eyes with every chew. It was simple. Bread, cheese, a bit of lettuce, but to him it tasted like kindness. After eating, he leaned back and looked at the sky. The city lights drowned out the stars, but he didn't mind. His thoughts were far away, back to the days when his name was printed on posters, when people lined up to hear him play. He remembered the sound of applause, the heavy curtain rising, and the proud smile of the music teacher who once told him, "You were born for the piano." Those words echoed in his mind, and something stirred inside him, a faint spark of the man he used to be. He pulled his backpack close and opened the small front pocket. Inside was a folded photograph. It showed him standing beside a grand piano, wearing a suit, a genuine smile on his face. That picture was the only proof left of his old life. The night grew colder. He stood up, slung the bag over his shoulder, and began walking again. He didn't know where he was going, but his feet carried him back toward the sound of life. The streets filled with people and light. After a while, he found himself outside another cafe. This one was smaller, with only a few tables and a warm orange glow from the inside. Through the window, he saw a small upright piano sitting in the corner. The sight stopped him in his tracks. He pressed a hand against the glass, almost as if trying to feel the keys through it. The cafe wasn't crowded. Just a few people sipping coffee, some talking softly, a barista wiping down the counter. He could see a small "Help Wanted" sign taped near the register. He hesitated. His last experience still lingered painfully in his mind. The laughter, the judgment, it all played over again. But then his stomach growled and he knew he couldn't just keep walking. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. A bell above the door chimed gently. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. The barista looked up, a young woman with tired eyes but a kind face. "Good evening," she said. "Can I get you something?" He shook his head slowly. I don't have money," he admitted softly. "But I can play that piano. Maybe just for a meal?" The barista looked at him, unsure what to say. "You play?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, I do." There was a pause. One of the customers at the counter, a middle-aged man with a book in his hand, chuckled under his breath. "Another one of those street performers, huh?" he said quietly but loud enough to be heard. The barista frowned at the comment, then looked back at the man. "All right," she said after a moment. "You can play one song. Let's see what you've got." His eyes brightened, and for the first time in a long while he smiled. "Thank you," he said gently. He walked over to the piano, pulled out the small bench, and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Then he began to play. The first few notes were soft and hesitant, but then the music grew. The melody wrapped around the small cafe like a warm blanket. Every sound he made seemed to tell a story of dreams, of heartbreak, of hope. The barista stopped wiping the counter. The man with the book slowly lowered it. The only sound in the room was the piano. He wasn't just playing. He was speaking through the keys. Every emotion he had bottled up spilled out as music. The notes rose and fell like waves, gentle but full of power. The people in the cafe couldn't look away. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was heavy. Then slowly someone began to clap. Others joined in. Even the man with the book smiled and nodded. The barista came over with a small plate. "Here," she said softly. "It's on the house." His eyes filled with tears as he looked at the food. Just soup and bread, but to him it meant everything. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled. "You're welcome, that was beautiful." He ate slowly, savoring each bite. When he finished, he turned to the barista again. "Do you mind if I come back tomorrow? I could play again, maybe for a few tips or something." She thought for a moment, then nodded. "You can come back," she said. "People would love to hear you." That night he left the cafe with a lighter heart. The cold air didn't sting as much anymore. For the first time in a long while he felt seen, not as a burden or a beggar, but as someone who still had something to give. He walked along the street, humming softly to himself, the melody from earlier still in his mind. He didn't know what the future would bring, but that night, he felt a small piece of hope return. And somewhere deep inside, he promised himself, this time, he wouldn't let the music fade away again. The next morning came quietly. The man woke up on a park bench, his thin coat pulled tight around his body. The sun had just started to rise, spreading soft orange light through the trees. He sat there for a while, blinking away sleep, trying to remember where he was. The cold from the night still clung to his bones, but his heart felt a little lighter than it had in days. He remembered the cafe, the warm light, the piano, the sound of people clapping. He smiled faintly. It had been such a long time since anyone had listened to him play with real interest. That moment gave him something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He stood up, brushed the dust from his coat, and stretched his arms. The city was waking up around him. Cars honking, shopkeepers unlocking doors, people hurrying to work. He started walking back toward the cafe. His steps were slow but steady. For once he had a destination. When he reached the cafe, the morning rush had begun. People lined up for coffee. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air and soft music played from a small speaker near the counter. Through the window, he saw the same barista from the night before. She was serving customers, her hair tied back, moving quickly behind the counter. He hesitated at the door, nervous again. What if she changed her mind? What if she didn't want him there anymore? But before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open. The bell chimed softly. She looked up and recognized him right away. "You came back," she said, smiling. "Yes," he said, almost shyly. "You said I could play again," she nodded. "Go ahead. People liked you last night." His heart lifted. He nodded gratefully and went straight to the piano. He sat down, placed his backpack beside the bench, and ran his fingers across the keys. They were slightly cold but smooth. He began to play a slow, gentle tune, a melody that floated through the cafe like morning sunlight. The customers one by one started turning their heads. Conversations softened. Some smiled, some simply listened. The barista leaned against the counter, resting her chin on her hand, and watched quietly. This time his playing was calmer. There was no fear in it, no rush to prove himself. He just played because it felt right. Every note carried warmth, like he was sharing a piece of his soul with whoever cared to listen. When he finished, a few people clapped again. Someone dropped a few coins on the piano top before leaving. The barista came over, placing a cup of hot coffee beside him. "Here," she said softly. "You earned this." He looked up, eyes shining. "Thank you," she smiled. "You have real talent. You should keep coming. I don't know much about music, but people need to hear you." He nodded slowly, holding the warm cup between his hands. "Music is all I have left," he said quietly. For the next few days, he came back to that cafe every morning. The barista would let him play, and he would fill the small space with melodies that made people pause and listen. Some left tips, others just offered kind words. Each day, he earned enough to buy a small meal. Soon people started talking about him. "That man who plays at the corner cafe, he's incredible," someone said one morning. Others began stopping by just to hear him play before work. The cafe, once quiet, began to buzz with life and curiosity. One afternoon, as he played a lively tune, a young man with a camera entered the cafe. He ordered a drink but spent most of the time recording the performance. When the man finished, the young man walked up to him and said, "Sir, that was amazing. Mind if I post this online? People should see this." He blinked in surprise. "Online?" he repeated softly. "Yeah," the man said, smiling. "Trust me, folks will love it." He didn't fully understand, but he nodded. "If you'd like," he said gently. That night, the young man posted the video with a short caption. "Homeless pianist plays like a professional." Within hours, it started spreading. People shared it, commented on it, and asked who the man was. The next day, when he returned to the cafe, the barista ran to him with excitement. "You're all over the internet," she said, laughing. "Everyone's talking about you." He looked confused. "Me?" She nodded, turning her phone around to show him the video. There he was, sitting at the piano, lost in the music, eyes closed, completely unaware of the world watching. The comments poured in. "He's incredible. That's real talent. Someone find this man and help him." He stared at the screen, stunned. His heart felt heavy and light all at once. He didn't know what to say. People started coming to the cafe, curious to see him play in person. Some brought gifts, warm clothes, sandwiches, even cash. Others simply wanted to shake his hand and tell him how his music touched them. It was overwhelming but beautiful. That same evening, a reporter showed up. She waited patiently until he finished playing. "Sir," she said gently, "I'm from the local news. Would you mind sharing your story?" He hesitated. "My story?" "Yes," she said softly. "People want to know who you are." He looked down at his hands for a long moment, then said quietly, "There's not much to tell. I just lost my way, that's all." She smiled kindly. "And you found it again through music. That's something people need to hear." He agreed, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe part of him wanted the world to remember him as more than just a man on the streets. Maybe he wanted to prove that no matter how far life dragged you down, there was always a piece of beauty left to share. The news story aired the next night. It showed clips of him playing, the cafe filled with smiling faces. The headline read, "Once famous pianist rediscovers his gift on the streets." When he saw it, tears filled his eyes. He hadn't been called famous in years, but it wasn't fame he wanted. It was respect, dignity. And in that small cafe, surrounded by strangers who listened with open hearts, he finally felt human again. Days turned into weeks. The cafe became his new stage. People came not for fancy meals or big shows, but to feel something real. His music gave them that, a sense of peace, a reminder of what truly matters. Sometimes, between songs, he would look out the window and see people stopping outside just to listen through the glass. and every time he would smile quietly to himself. The laughter and mockery from that first restaurant were just memories now. What replaced them was something far more powerful: kindness, connection, and a chance to belong again. One evening, as he packed up his things, the barista came over. "There's someone here who wants to meet you," she said. He turned around, curious. Standing near the door was a man in a dark coat holding a folder. "I saw your video," the man said. "I work with a small music label. We'd like to help you record." The pianist froze, unsure if he heard right. "Record?" he whispered. The man nodded. "Yes, people deserve to hear you properly. We'll take care of everything." For a moment, he couldn't speak. He felt the tears burning his eyes again. The barista smiled and said softly, "See? I told you people needed to hear you." That night, as he walked away from the cafe under the glow of the streetlights, his heart was full. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. The city around him looked different now, warmer, brighter, alive. And though he still carried his old backpack and wore the same worn shoes, something inside him had changed. He was no longer just a man playing for food. He was a musician again, a man with purpose, with music that spoke louder than words. And deep down he knew this was only the beginning of his second chance. The following week changed everything. Each morning, more people came to the cafe just to hear him play. Some brought their children, others came before work or after school. The little cafe that had once been quiet was now alive with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation. The barista sometimes stood behind the counter, watching in quiet amazement. It was as if his music had turned an ordinary place into something special. He played every day, pouring his heart into every song. He didn't use sheet music, he didn't need to. Every tune came from memory, from emotion, from somewhere deep inside. Sometimes his music sounded joyful and bright, and other times it carried a sadness that made people close their eyes and just listen. Each note told part of his story without words. Soon newspapers picked up the online story. Headlines began to appear. "Homeless man mesmerizes city with piano talent." People started calling the cafe to ask when he would be performing next. Some came from different towns just to see him. At first, all the attention made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to people wanting to talk to him or take pictures. But then he realized something important. This wasn't about fame or attention. It was about connection. His music reminded people of something they had forgotten, how simple beauty could touch a heart. One afternoon, a woman walked into the cafe carrying a bouquet of flowers. She waited until he finished playing, then stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "My husband loved the piano," she said softly. "He passed away last year. When I heard you play, it felt like he was here again. Thank you." He didn't know what to say. He stood there quietly for a moment, then smiled gently. "Music remembers," he said. "Even when people forget." The cafe grew busier with every passing day. The barista hired an extra pair of hands to help. Tips overflowed from the small jar on the counter. And for the first time in years, he had a little money of his own. He used some of it to buy a clean shirt and a pair of shoes from a thrift store. When he looked in the mirror afterward, he barely recognized himself. He still had tired eyes, but there was light in them again. One evening after closing, the barista sat down across from him. "You've changed this place," she said with a smile. "People come in happy now. They say your music makes their day better." He looked down at his hands. "I never meant to change anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted to play." "Maybe that's why it works," she said softly. "You play with heart." A few days later, a man in a suit entered the cafe during one of his performances. He stood near the door, listening without saying a word. When the song ended, he walked up and introduced himself. "I'm from a local concert hall," he said. "We saw your video. Would you consider performing on our stage?" The pianist blinked, unsure if he heard right. "Me? Perform? In a hall?" The man nodded. "Yes, we host a charity event every month. People would love to hear you play." For a moment, the old fear crept in, the same feeling he had when he first asked to play in that restaurant. What if they laughed again? What if he didn't belong there? But then he thought of the faces at the cafe, the clapping, the kindness. He took a slow breath and said, "Yes, I'll do it." That night he could hardly sleep. He kept picturing the grand hall, the shining piano, the crowd. It had been so long since he'd been on a real stage. His fingers tingled with both excitement and nerves. He told himself over and over, "This time it will be different." When the day finally came, he arrived early. The hall was larger than he remembered. Rows of red seats, golden lights hanging from above, a stage polished to a shine. He ran his fingers over the edge of the grand piano, feeling its smooth surface. For a moment he stood there in silence, remembering everything he had lost and everything he had found again. As the audience began to fill the seats, he peeked from behind the curtain. The barista was there, smiling and waving. So were some of the regulars from the cafe. They had all come to support him. Seeing them gave him courage. When the lights dimmed and the announcer called his name, he walked out onto the stage. For a brief moment, he felt small under the bright lights. Then he sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and let the world fade away. The first note rang out clear and full of emotion. He played not for fame, not for approval, but for life itself. For every cold night, every hungry day, every kind soul who believed in him. The music rose and fell like a heartbeat, filling the hall with warmth. When the final note lingered in the air, there was silence. Then applause broke out, soft at first, then louder and louder until it filled the entire hall. People stood on their feet, clapping and cheering. Some shouted his name. He bowed his head, tears shining in his eyes. After the show, reporters surrounded him again. "How does it feel to be back on stage?" one asked. He smiled humbly. "It feels like coming home," he said simply. The next morning, pictures from the concert spread everywhere. People who had never met him spoke about how his story inspired them. Offers started coming in. Music companies, charities, even television shows wanted to feature him. But he didn't rush to say yes to anything. He just wanted to play where people listened with open hearts. He kept returning to the cafe no matter how busy his days became. That little place had given him his second chance. He told the barista one morning, "I'll never forget this place. It saved me." She smiled and handed him a cup of coffee. "No," she said gently. "You saved yourself. We just gave you a piano." The word stayed with him. He realized she was right. All the pain, all the years of silence, had led him back to the one thing that never betrayed him: music. Weeks passed, and his story continued to travel far beyond the city. People from other countries sent letters, thanking him for reminding them that hope could be found anywhere. Some said they started playing instruments again after hearing his music. Others said his story helped them believe in second chances. One evening, as he sat alone in the cafe after closing, he played softly to himself. The lights were dim, the city outside was quiet. He thought of that first night when he had asked, "Can I perform for food?" and the laughter that followed. Now he smiled at the memory. They had scoffed then, but not anymore. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would still be hard days, moments of doubt and memories that hurt, but now he had something solid to hold on to. He had his purpose, his gift, and a world that finally listened. As he finished the last soft note, he whispered into the empty room, "Thank you for listening." Then he sat there for a long time, eyes closed, letting the silence feel like applause. Outside, the city lights glowed softly, and somewhere in the distance a stranger walked by, hearing the faint sound of a piano through the window. The melody drifted into the night, gentle and real, a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest places, music can bring you home. The night of the concert arrived faster than he expected. The air was cool and the city was glowing with lights. As he stood behind the curtain of the grand hall, he could hear the murmur of the crowd. Hundreds of people had come, many of them dressed in elegant clothes. He felt nervous but also calm in a strange way. This was different from the restaurant where they laughed at him, and different from the cafe where he had first been rediscovered. This time he was here because people believed in him. The stage manager gave him a small nod. It was time. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the light. The audience clapped politely at first, but when they saw him walk to the piano, something shifted. They could sense the humility in his steps, the story that hung in the air before a single note was played. He sat down, placed his hands gently on the keys, and closed his eyes. For a moment there was silence. Then he began to play. The first note was soft like a whisper. The next carried a weight that filled the room. Each sound felt alive, filled with emotion, joy, sadness, and gratitude woven together. His fingers moved with confidence, no hesitation, no fear. The grand piano seemed to breathe with him, responding to his every touch. The crowd sat completely still. Some leaned forward, others wiped quiet tears. It wasn't just music, they could feel his story in every chord. The loneliness, the hunger, the hope, it was all there. When he finished, the hall erupted in applause. People stood, clapping and cheering. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others simply stayed silent, overwhelmed by emotion. He stood and bowed, but his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from disbelief. For so long he had been invisible. Now he was seen. Truly seen. After the concert, people came up to him, asking questions, offering compliments, shaking his hand. The man from the concert hall smiled and said, "You've given everyone something they'll never forget." He thanked them all quietly, but his heart was somewhere else. He was thinking about the park benches, the nights without food, and the small cafe that had believed in him first. The next morning, his face was on the front page of a newspaper again. The headline read, "From Street to Stage, the pianist who played his way home." The article told his story, how he had once been homeless, how his talent was discovered by chance, and how he had now touched thousands of hearts. Messages poured in from around the world. Some offered him recording deals, others wanted to feature him on television. But despite the attention, he remained humble. He still went back to the cafe, still played the same old piano, still smiled when someone stopped to listen. When people asked him why, he said softly, "This is where I started again. I'll never forget that." One afternoon, as he played, a small group of children gathered near the door, watching him with wide eyes. When he finished, one of them stepped forward and asked, "Can you teach us?" He smiled, thinking about all the teachers who had once believed in him. "Of course," he said, "music is meant to be shared." Soon the cafe became more than just a place to eat. It became a small music school in the mornings. He taught children who couldn't afford lessons, showing them how to move their fingers gently over the keys. "Don't play for fame," he would tell them. "Play because your heart needs to speak." The cafe owner watched with pride. "You've turned this place into something beautiful," she said one day. He looked around at the laughing children, the sound of beginner notes filling the air, and smiled. "Music saved me," he said. Now it's saving others, but his story didn't stop there. A few months later, he received a letter from a major orchestra, inviting him to perform as a guest pianist. It was an opportunity beyond anything he had dreamed. The concert would be broadcast live, watched by millions. He hesitated at first. The idea of being on such a big stage again made him nervous. But then he thought about the people who had helped him. The boy who had shared a sandwich, the barista who gave him a chance, the strangers who clapped in that cafe. He realized that playing wasn't about him anymore. It was about them, all the people who had believed when no one else did. So he said yes. The weeks leading up to the concert were busy. He practiced every day, sometimes until his fingers ached. He worked with other musicians, blending his humble street-learned passion with their trained precision. They respected him deeply, not just for his skill, but for his spirit. On the night of the performance, as he stood behind the curtain again, he closed his eyes and whispered a quiet thank you. To life, to music, to every person who had shown kindness when the world didn't. When he sat down at the piano, the hall went silent. Cameras rolled, lights glowed, and millions of people watched from their homes. But for him, it felt like he was back in that cafe again, just playing for a small room full of open hearts. The music began. It was not loud or fast, it was pure and honest. Every note carried the weight of his journey. As he played, he thought of that first night when he had asked, "Can I perform for food?" and the laughter that followed. Now he smiled quietly at the thought. The same hands that once begged to play for a meal were now applauded by the world. When he played the final note, the hall rose in a standing ovation. People clapped, cried, and cheered. The conductor shook his hand and whispered, "You didn't just play music, you reminded us why we listen." Afterward, interviews and cameras surrounded him again, but this time he didn't shy away. He spoke softly into the microphone. "There was a time when I thought I had nothing left," he said. "But I learned that as long as your heart still beats, you can start again. Music gave me that second chance. I hope my story reminds someone out there not to give up. That night, as he walked back through the quiet city streets, he passed the cafe. The lights were off, but he could still see the piano through the window. He stopped for a moment, smiling to himself. The reflection in the glass showed a man who looked older, wiser but peaceful. He whispered softly, "We made it." From that day forward, his name became known not just as a musician, but as a symbol of hope. He continued to perform, but never forgot the park bench where he once sat hungry, or the first person who gave him a chance to play. Wherever he went, he carried the same message. Talent means nothing without heart, and heart means everything when life gets hard. People who met him said he never acted like a star. He listened to everyone, treated everyone with kindness, and always said thank you. His fame didn't change him. It only gave him more chances to share what he loved. And every time he played, whether on a big stage or in a small cafe, his music carried the same message: that no one is ever too lost to be found again, and that sometimes one act of kindness can change a life forever. As his final note echoed through each hall he played in, the people who heard it felt more than sound. They felt the journey of a man who asked only to perform for food, and instead found a way to feed souls. The months that followed were full of change. The man who once wandered the streets with empty pockets now traveled from city to city, carrying nothing but his music and gratitude. Yet fame never sat heavily on his shoulders. He never forgot where it had all begun, with hunger, humility, and a single question that changed everything. When people interviewed him, they often asked, "How does it feel to be famous?" He would smile and say, "I don't think I am. I'm just someone who got lucky enough to be heard." Despite the growing attention, he still chose simplicity. He stayed in small apartments, preferred walking over driving, and spent long hours at the piano. Music to him wasn't a job or a show, it was life itself. One morning, he returned to the cafe where everything had started. It looked a little different now, new paint, brighter lights, more customers, but the feeling was the same. The barista who once gave him his first chance was still there, older now but smiling the same way. "You've been gone a long time," she said warmly. He smiled. "I've been playing in many places, but somehow it still feels like I belong here." She nodded. "This will always be your home." He sat at the same piano by the window and began to play softly. The customers turned their heads, recognizing the melody. It was gentle and familiar, the same song he had played that first night when he asked for food. The cafe fell silent again, just like back then. After the last note, the room filled with applause. But this time he wasn't hungry. He wasn't lost. He was whole. That evening, as he left the cafe, a young boy stopped him outside. The boy was holding a small keyboard under his arm. "Sir," he said shyly, "I saw you play online. I want to learn to play like you." He smiled kindly. "Do you have a teacher?" The boy shook his head. "No. My mom says lessons are too expensive." He thought for a moment, then placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come here on weekends," he said. "Bring your keyboard. I'll teach you." From that day, every Saturday morning, he taught a group of children in the cafe. They learned not only about notes and keys, but also about patience, kindness, and the power of believing in themselves. Sometimes he told them stories from his own life, how people once laughed at him, how he played for food, how the smallest act of kindness changed his path. The children listened with wide eyes. To them, he wasn't just a famous pianist. He was proof that hope can survive even in the hardest times. One afternoon, a reporter visited the cafe again. She watched him teach and asked, "Why do you keep coming back here? You could be performing anywhere in the world." He looked around at the smiling faces of the children and said simply, "Because this is where I was given my first chance. I want to give that chance to others." The article she wrote about him went viral once more, but this time the world didn't just see him as the man who rose from the streets. They saw him as a teacher, a giver, a man who used his success to lift others. As the years passed, he continued performing across the world, yet he never missed a single Saturday lesson. He grew older, but his passion never faded. Wherever he went, people greeted him with warmth. Some brought old newspaper clippings or photos from his early days. Others just wanted to shake his hand and say, "Thank you for the music." One evening, he was invited to play at a huge international concert. The stage was enormous and people from dozens of countries filled the seats. As he waited behind the curtain, he felt a calmness in his heart. He wasn't nervous this time. He wasn't trying to prove anything. When he walked onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet in respect before he even played. He bowed deeply, feeling humbled by the love in the room. Then he sat down and began to play the piece he had written just for that night, a piece called The Road Back. The music began softly, like the quiet footsteps of a man walking alone through a city. Then it grew stronger, warmer, full of hope and light. The notes told his whole story, the hunger, the rejection, the rediscovery, the love, and the peace he had finally found. Halfway through, he closed his eyes and let his fingers move on their own. He wasn't reading from anything. It was pure emotion flowing out of him. The audience sat frozen, caught between silence and awe. When the last chord faded, there was no sound for a long moment. Then the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. People stood cheering and clapping until their hands hurt. Some wiped tears from their faces. Others just smiled, grateful to have witnessed something real. He stood and bowed again, but this time he didn't just look at the audience, he looked upward, as if thanking the universe for bringing him full circle. Later that night, alone in his dressing room, he sat quietly with his hands resting on his lap. He thought of all the people who had crossed his path, the cafe owner, the kind strangers, the little boy learning to play. His eyes filled with quiet gratitude. He whispered to himself, "Everything I went through led me here." A knock came at the door. When he opened it, he found the young boy from the cafe, now grown, holding a bouquet of white flowers. "You were amazing," the young man said with a bright smile. "I'm performing next week too, you know. I got accepted to the music academy." The pianist's eyes softened. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Keep your heart in your music. That's all that matters." The young man nodded, his voice quiet. "I will. Because of you." After he left, the pianist turned back to the mirror. His reflection showed a man with gray hair and tired eyes, but also peace. A kind of peace that only comes from doing what you were meant to do. As the years went on, people still told his story. They spoke of the man who once asked to perform for food, not knowing he was a piano genius. They shared videos, wrote articles, and quoted his words. Music remembers even when people forget. He continued to play until his hands grew slower, his steps lighter. In his final concert, he ended with the same melody he had once played in that little cafe. When the last note lingered in the air, he looked at the crowd and smiled one last time. He didn't need applause anymore. He already had everything he ever wanted, a full heart, a second chance, and a legacy built on kindness. And long after he was gone, people still spoke his name softly, remembering the man who had turned hunger into harmony. His story became a reminder that greatness can come from the humblest places, and that sometimes, all it takes to change a life is one simple act of belief. Every time someone sat at a piano, somewhere, and played that old familiar tune, they remembered him, the man who asked, "Can I perform for food?" and ended up feeding the world with music.